Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm curious how many of you are watching this alone, in the dark, perhaps later than you should be, in one of HP. In Lovecraft's stories, a character discovers an ancient text describing strange worshippers. It says, "They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who would return one day to claim the earth again." That single line captures something deeply unsettling. These aren't cults promising salvation or enlightenment. They're groups devoted to entities that existed before humanity and will exist long after we're gone. Beings so vast that our entire civilization is just a brief flicker to them. Today, we're examining the deadliest cults in Lovecraft's mythology. Not real organizations, but fictional ones that feel disturbingly plausible. Groups that worship the outer gods: Cthulhu, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath. Names that sound wrong when you say them out loud. What makes this worth exploring is how these invented cults have escaped their stories. People have tried to publish the Necronomicon as if it were real. Occultists have incorporated Lovecraft's entities into actual rituals. Gaming communities have spent decades mapping out what these organizations would actually do. We'll start with Lovecraft himself in the 1920s and 30s. Where did he get these ideas? What cultural anxieties was he channeling? Then we'll examine specific groups: the Esoteric Order of Dagon, the Whately family, the global Cthulhu cult. Finally, we'll trace how this mythology leaked into our world and why it still resonates. Let's begin with how Lovecraft built them in the first place. Howard Phillips Lovecraft wrote his most important stories between 1926 and 1937. That's when he built the mythology we're talking about today. And at the center of everything were these cults, groups worshiping things that shouldn't be worshipped. The breakthrough came in 1926 with The Call of Cthulhu. That's where Lovecraft showed us something new. His cults weren't meeting in secret castles or holding elaborate ceremonies in hidden temples. They were everywhere. A sailor in the Pacific, artists in Paris, people in the Louisiana swamps. None of them knew each other. They'd never met. But they were all having the same dreams, all carving the same twisted figures, all chanting words in a language that shouldn't exist. Think about how disturbing that is. These people didn't choose to join. They were chosen. Something reached into their minds while they slept and planted images there, instructions, compulsions they couldn't resist. Traditional Gothic horror gave you vampire hunters and secret societies with membership lists. Lovecraft gave you the possibility that right now, while you're watching this, someone across the world might be dreaming the same impossible geometry you'll dream tonight. Lovecraft designed this deliberately. His letters from the 1920s show he was reading about ancient mystery religions, the cult of Dionysus, the Eleusinian mysteries, the worship of Cybele in Rome. He studied how these groups operated, what they promised their members. Then he inverted everything. Ancient mystery cults offered transformation, enlightenment, communion with gods who cared about you. Lovecraft's cults offered only the certainty that nothing you do matters. The entities they worship existed billions of years before humans. They'll exist billions of years after we're gone, and they've never noticed us at all. Here's what makes this especially unsettling when you understand the context. Lovecraft was writing during a period of massive social change. Immigration was transforming American cities. New ethnic groups were arriving with different languages, different customs, different ways of understanding the world. Lovecraft, sitting in Providence, Rhode Island, watched his neighborhood change. His letters show he was terrified, not just uncomfortable, genuinely frightened that something fundamental about civilization was being lost. His cults embody that fear. They represent the possibility that underneath everything we call progress and rationality, older allegiances are waiting. That maybe the immigrants in his neighborhood weren't really integrating into American culture. Maybe they were carrying something ancient with them, something that predated Christianity, predated Western civilization entirely. In story after story, Lovecraft's investigators discover that the cults were always there. They just learned to hide. And now, in the modern world with its trains and telegraphs making the world smaller, they're starting to coordinate. But there's something even more philosophically disturbing happening. The 1920s were when scientific materialism essentially won. Evolution had made human beings just another animal. Geology had made the Earth billions of years old. Astronomy had revealed our planet as a speck in an incomprehensible void. Traditional religion couldn't comfortably fit into this new understanding. The universe science was revealing didn't care about humanity. It didn't have opinions about our morality or our prayers. Lovecraft's cults emerged directly from this crisis. They're what happens when people accept cosmic indifference, but still need something to orient themselves around. The cultist in a Lovecraft story isn't insane. Not exactly. They've followed materialist logic to its endpoint. If the universe is meaningless, if human existence is a cosmic accident, then worshipping entities that will eventually destroy us makes as much sense as anything else. Maybe more sense, because at least you're acknowledging reality. This is why Lovecraft's cults don't have theology. They don't claim Cthulhu loves them. They don't believe they'll be rewarded. They know, absolutely know, that when the old ones return, humanity will be obliterated without thought. They worship anyway, because they've seen something true, and you can't unsee truth. The protagonist in The Call of Cthulhu ends his account hoping he'll die before the stars come right. That's the only comfort Lovecraft offers. Maybe you'll be dead before it happens. Lovecraft was building a framework where knowledge itself could destroy you. Not magic, not demonic corruption, just information. Facts about how reality actually works. Facts that human psychology isn't equipped to handle. The cult became his vehicle for exploring this. What happens when you learn something true that you desperately wish was false? What do you do with that information? How do you live normally after you've understood that nothing is normal? His story suggests the answer is, you can't. You either go mad, or you join the cult, or you die. Those are the options. The investigator who learns too much never just files it away and goes back to teaching. At the university, the knowledge changes them, corrupts them, not morally, factually. They're different after they know. And here's the worst part. Lovecraft wrote these stories almost 100 years ago. Since then, we've learned the universe is even bigger, older, and more indifferent than he imagined. We've discovered that the vast majority of reality is literally invisible to us. Dark matter, dark energy, things we know exist but can't perceive. We've found planets around other stars. We've pushed our instruments deeper into space and time and found nothing that suggests the universe notices we're here. Lovecraft's cults feel more plausible now than they did in 1926. That should worry us. Let's look at where he found the specific cultural materials to build these groups. Lovecraft didn't invent the idea of dangerous worship. He pulled from traditions that were already unsettling people in the early 20th century. And he was reading, constantly, obsessively, about the Kinds of religious practices that made modern people uncomfortable start with the ancient mystery cults. The Eleusinian mysteries near Athens had operated for thousands of years. Initiates went through secret ceremonies that supposedly revealed profound truths about death and the afterlife. What exactly happened in those ceremonies, we still don't fully know. The initiates took vows of secrecy so seriously that almost nothing leaked out. That gap in knowledge, that void where the truth should be, that's what Lovecraft exploited. He took the structure of mystery religions and filled it with worship of things that shouldn't be worshipped. Then there was the cult of Cybele, an Anatolian goddess whose worship reached Rome around 200 BCE. Her priests castrated themselves in ecstatic rituals. They whipped themselves bloody. They prophesied in trance states. Roman authorities found this disturbing, but couldn't completely suppress it because Cybele had supposedly protected Rome during the Punic Wars. So the worship continued, barely tolerated, always suspect. Lovecraft read about these practices and understood something important. People will mutilate themselves, will destroy their own bodies if they believe they've accessed something transcendent. The body becomes negotiable once you've seen past it. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw an explosion of interest in occultism. Helena Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society in 1875, claiming she'd learned secret wisdom from hidden masters in Tibet. Her book, The Secret Doctrine, proposed that humanity was just the latest in a series of root races that had inhabited Earth. Before us came the Lemurians, the Atlanteans, other civilizations now lost. She claimed ancient texts proved this, texts most scholars had never heard of. Whether Blavatsky was a fraud or genuinely deluded doesn't really matter. What matters is that thousands of educated people believed her. They wanted to believe that modern science hadn't discovered everything, that older and stranger knowledge existed. Lovecraft absorbed all of this. His invented texts, the Necronomicon, the Pennacotic manuscripts, the Book of Ibon, worked the same way Blavatsky's sources did. They're books that supposedly exist, that supposedly contain information conventional scholarship has ignored. The difference is that Lovecraft's books don't promise enlightenment. They promise madness and destruction. Reading them doesn't elevate you. It contaminates you. He was also reading anthropology, particularly James Fraser's The Golden Bough, published in 1890. Fraser's massive study compared religious practices across cultures and proposed that all societies went through similar stages of development. Magic came first, then religion, then science. Primitive peoples were supposedly stuck in earlier stages. Modern Europeans had evolved beyond them. This was racist anthropology, and Lovecraft, being quite racist himself, found it validating. But he added his own twist. What if those primitive practices weren't earlier stages of development? What if they were memories? What if indigenous peoples worshiping strange gods were actually maintaining traditions that predated humanity itself? This is where things get particularly disturbing. Lovecraft suggested that certain groups, Pacific Islanders, Inuit populations, people in isolated regions, had preserved knowledge the rest of humanity had forgotten. And that forgetting was protective. Civilization required amnesia, required deliberately not knowing what our ancestors knew. The cults in his stories are often found in places Western civilization hasn't fully penetrated. Remote islands, deep swamps, Arctic wastelands, places where the old ways survived. Arthur Machen's stories gave Lovecraft more tools. Machen's The Great God Pan, published in 1894, featured ancient pagan worship surviving secretly in modern Wales. The god Pan hadn't died when Christianity arrived. He'd just learned to hide better. Machain's work suggested that underneath Christian England, older and more primal forces were waiting. Lovecraft transported this idea to New England. What if the Puritan witch trials had been responses to something real, not to devil worship? That would be too Christian, too comprehensible, but to surviving pre-human cults that had operated on the continent long before Europeans arrived. Algernon Blackwood contributed the idea of indifferent nature gods. His entities didn't hate humanity. They simply existed on such a different scale that human concerns were invisible to them. A person encountering these forces wasn't attacked. They were just in the way, like an ant under your shoe. You don't hate the ant. You don't even notice you've killed it. Lovecraft took this indifference and made it cosmic rather than natural. His outer gods operate across dimensions, across aeons. Human civilization could rise and fall in the time it takes them to have a single thought. The early 20th century was also paranoid about secret societies. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, alleged Jewish conspiracies controlling world events. Lovecraft was writing during a period when people genuinely believed that small groups with special knowledge might be manipulating history. His cults tap into that anxiety. But instead of controlling politics or finance, they're preparing for something vastly worse. They're coordinating humanity's obsolescence. Here's what makes this particularly effective as horror. Traditional devil worship, the kind you'd find in older Gothic fiction, was transgressive but ultimately comprehensible. You worship Satan because he offered you power, wealth, or pleasure. It was wrong, but the logic was clear. Lovecraft's cults worship entities that offer nothing. No power, no reward. Just the knowledge that when the stars align properly, everything humans have ever built will mean nothing. The cultists prepare for this. They welcome it. They've seen past human concerns entirely, and some of them are breeding with these entities, having children with them, creating hybrids. This wasn't just shocking for Lovecraft's era. It was tapping into deep anxieties about miscegenation, about bloodlines being corrupted. But he pushed it beyond racial mixing between human groups. He was talking about human-alien hybridization, about producing offspring that would be something other than human. Children who belonged more to the old ones than to humanity. The cultural materials Lovecraft was working with, mystery cults, occult revivals, anthropological theories, secret society paranoia, all of these were already present in the early 20th century. He didn't invent them. He synthesized them into something new, something that suggested your neighbor might be part of an organization preparing for humanity's extinction. And they might be doing it because it's the rational response to what they've learned. That brings us to the language these cults speak and why it matters. The cults in Lovecraft's stories don't speak English when they worship. They use languages that sound wrong. Languages that suggest anatomies different from ours producing the sounds. Take the most famous example. Finglui manglubunaf, Cthulhu Relie, Waganagel Ftagn. This appears in The Call of Cthulhu, supposedly meaning, in his house at Relie, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Those aren't sounds a human throat should be able to make. Too many consonants bunched together, vowels in positions that don't work in any human language. When you try to pronounce it, something feels physically wrong. That's intentional. Lovecraft was creating the impression of language without actually creating functional languages. He wanted words that suggested deep time, alien anatomies, thoughts that don't map onto human concepts. The Arleahian language, the tongue supposedly spoken by Cthulhu's worshippers, isn't meant to be learned. It's meant to suggest something that can't be learned, that human mouths and minds aren't equipped to handle properly. He borrowed some of this technique from Arthur Machen. Machen's stories mentioned a language called Aklo, supposedly used by inhuman entities. Machen never defined it, never gave more than a few words. That vagueness was powerful. It let readers imagine something genuinely alien rather than just another human language with different grammar. Lovecraft took this and ran with it. His stories mention Aklo too, along with Arleyehian, and other unnamed tongues recorded only in forbidden texts. The symbolic systems work the same way. There's the elder sign, supposed to protect against the outer gods. But Lovecraft never settled on exactly what it looked like. Different stories describe it differently. Sometimes it's a star shape, sometimes a branch pattern, sometimes just a gesture made with the hands. This inconsistency bothered some readers, but it actually makes the mythology more effective. If the elder sign looked the same in every story, it would just be a fantasy symbol. The fact that it varies suggests something that can't be properly represented, that each human who encounters it records it slightly differently because we're not equipped to perceive it accurately. The same goes for cult names. Some groups get specific titles: the Esoteric Order of Dagon, the Starry Wisdom Sect. Others are just the cult, or the worshippers. That mix of specificity and vagueness creates unease. The named cults feel historical, documented. The unnamed ones feel like they're everywhere, operating without bothering to identify themselves. They don't need names. They just need the stars to be right. Lovecraft also gave his cults specific vocabulary. They don't pray, they perform rites. They don't convert people, they initiate them, or simply wait for them to respond to psychic summons. They don't have churches, they have hidden congregations, or assemblies. This terminology matters because it distances these groups from conventional religion. A church suggests community, morality, spiritual growth. An assembly suggests coordination for a specific purpose. And that purpose is usually summoning something. The invented texts use archaic English when quoted. The Necronomicon supposedly dates to 730 CE in its original Arabic. But when characters read it in Lovecraft's stories, it's always in stilted, outdated English. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons, even death may die. That's the Necronomicon's most famous couplet. Notice the grammar. That is not dead, which can eternal lie. It's grammatically odd, slightly wrong. It sounds translated, but translated badly, as if the concepts don't quite fit into human language. This technique creates the impression of deep historical authenticity. When you read old texts, actual medieval or Renaissance documents, the language feels strange because idioms and grammar have shifted. Lovecraft mimicked that feeling. His forbidden books sound old because they use outdated constructions. But they're not just old, they're wrong. The grammar doesn't follow patterns from any actual historical period of English. It's as if someone who didn't quite understand human language was trying to communicate. Geographic names work similarly. Arkham, Innsmouth, Dunwich. These are Lovecraft's invented New England towns, and they sound almost real. They follow the patterns of actual Massachusetts place names, combinations of English and indigenous words, or archaic English terms. But they're slightly off. You won't find them on any map. Yet they feel like you should be able to. Like maybe you just haven't looked carefully enough. This creates a specific kind of dread. If these places existed, they'd be close to actual towns. They'd have zip codes and post offices. The cults operating there wouldn't be fantasy villains in distant lands. They'd be your neighbors, people you could drive to visit if you wanted. That proximity is crucial to making the horror work. The ritual terminology draws from actual occult grimoires. Terms like summoning, binding, the hour of alignment. These appear in real medieval magic texts. Lovecraft was familiar with this material. He'd read about the Key of Solomon, about Renaissance grimoires, about ceremonial magic traditions. He took that vocabulary and applied it to entities that wouldn't be bound by human magic. The cultists in his stories use the language of control. Summoning implies bringing something to you. Binding implies constraining it, but they're deluding themselves. You can't bind Cthulhu. You can only wake him up. That gap between the language of control and the reality of helplessness is where the horror lives. The cults think they're performing magic. They're actually just announcing humanity's obsolescence. The words they chant, the symbols they draw, the rites they perform, none of it gives them power. It just makes them complicit. And here's something disturbing. Linguists have actually analyzed Lovecraft's invented languages, trying to find patterns. Some have proposed phonological rules for Nyarlathotep, based on the few phrases that appear in the stories. Others have tried to create workable grammars. This is exactly what the characters in Lovecraft's stories do before they go mad. They try to systematize something that shouldn't be systematized. They try to make sense of it, and making sense of it is the first step toward worshiping it. So the language of Lovecraft's cults works because it sounds almost comprehensible. You feel like if you just listened more carefully, studied it longer, you could understand. That feeling is the trap. In Lovecraft's framework, understanding is contamination. The moment you grasp what Fenglui Maglwanaf actually means, not just the translation, but the concept behind it, you're no longer quite human. You've aligned yourself with something that existed before humanity and will exist after. Now we need to understand how Lovecraft made all of this feel real, how he built the illusion that these cults had histories, that they'd been operating for centuries, that investigators were discovering them rather than that an author was inventing them. Lovecraft didn't write his stories as if he was inventing a mythology. He wrote as if he was documenting one that already existed. That shift from creation to documentation is what made his cults feel real. The technique starts with cross-referencing. In The Call of Cthulhu, written in 1926, the protagonist mentions the Necronomicon and its mad Arab author, Abdul al-Hazred. Then in The Dunwich Horror, written in 1928, the Necronomicon appears again, this time with specific quotes and descriptions. Then other stories mention it. Soon you have 5, 6, 7 different stories all treating this book as a real historical text. Each story adds new details. The publication history, which libraries hold copies, what happened to people who read it. This creates a cumulative effect. After encountering the Necronomicon in multiple contexts, readers start thinking of it as a real book that exists somewhere. Lovecraft received letters asking where they could find a copy. Libraries reported patrons requesting it at circulation desks. The cross-referencing had worked. He'd made fiction feel like rediscovered history. He did this with the cults too. The Cthulhu cult appears in The Call of Cthulhu, then gets mentioned in passing in other stories. The esoteric order of Dagon appears in The Shadow over Innsmouth. Then other stories reference strange happenings in coastal Massachusetts towns. These connections suggest a world where multiple cults operate simultaneously, sometimes aware of each other, sometimes not. Just like real secret organizations would. But here's where Lovecraft's technique gets sophisticated. He never has his narrators witness a cult activities directly. You never get scenes of characters attending the rituals, speaking with the cultists during the ceremonies, seeing the summoning from the cultist's perspective. Instead, you get aftermath, police reports, testimony from traumatized witnesses who saw something briefly and didn't understand it, academic papers trying to make sense of fragmentary evidence. This indirection is crucial. Direct description would break the illusion. We'd see the machinery of fiction too clearly. But documentation, reports, testimonies, scholarly articles, these can be fragmentary, contradictory, incomplete. That incompleteness feels real. Real investigations are messy. Real historical records have gaps. Lovecraft exploited those gaps. Take The Call of Cthulhu as an example. The story is structured as a manuscript compiled by a man named Thurston, who's organizing his dead uncle's papers. His uncle, George Gamel Angel, was a professor who'd been investigating strange cult activities. Thurston is now piecing together what his uncle discovered. So, we're reading a documents about events. That distance, that layering of sources, mimics how historical research actually works. You're never at the event. You're always reading someone else's account of it. The story includes multiple forms of documentation. A police report about raiding a cult meeting in Louisiana. A newspaper clipping about a mysterious island found by sailors. An interview transcript with a Norwegian sailor who's the only survivor of an encounter with Cthulhu. Academic papers, personal journals. Each document has its own voice, its own concerns, its own limitations. The police don't understand the religious significance of what they're seeing. The sailor can't articulate what he witnessed because it was too far outside his reference frame. The professor tries to connect it all and dies mysteriously before publishing his findings. This technique does something disturbing. Suggests that the truth is out there, scattered across multiple sources, waiting to be assembled by someone patient enough to collect all the fragments. It turns readers into investigators. You're doing the same thing Thurston and his uncle did, piecing together a pattern from incomplete information. And if you succeed, if you actually grasp what Lovecraft's suggesting, then you've joined the cult epistemologically. You've accessed forbidden knowledge. Lovecraft's collaborative relationships with other writers amplified this effect. He encouraged Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, August Derleth, and others to use elements from his mythology in their own stories. Smith wrote about the Book of Ibon and Tsathoggua. Bloch used the Necronomicon and mentioned Lovecraft's invented New England towns. Robert E. Howard, better known for Conan, wrote The Black Stone and mentioned Ludwig Prin's Mysteries of the Worm. Now you had multiple authors writing independently, all treating these elements as if they existed. Readers encountering a Smith story might then read a Lovecraft story and see connections. This wasn't one author building a mythology. This was multiple authors documenting what seemed to be the same underlying reality. The collaborative expansion made it feel like these writers had all discovered the same hidden history. But Lovecraft went further. He blended his inventions with real history. The Shadow over Innsmouth mentions the War of 1812, actual New England geography, real historical events. The town of Innsmouth supposedly had a significant role in early American shipping. The Marsh family made their fortune in the Pacific trade. These details ground the fantastic elements in verifiable reality. You can look up the War of 1812. You can visit the Massachusetts coast. That makes the fictional elements harder to separate. He also incorporated real occult texts alongside his invented ones. The Necronomicon is pure fiction. But characters who consult, the Necronomicon also reference The Golden Bough by James Frazer, which is real, and Culte de Ghoul by the Comte d'Erlet, which isn't. Real and fake side by side, mixed so thoroughly that separating them requires research. And doing that research, looking up which books are real, means you're engaging with the material the same way Lovecraft's doomed protagonists do. There's something else happening with the narrative structure. Lovecraft's stories almost never end well. The investigator discovers the truth and either dies, goes mad, or commits suicide to escape the implications. This isn't just pessimistic plotting. It's a narrative technique that reinforces the mythology's authenticity. If these stories ended with the hero defeating the cult and destroying the threat, they'd feel like normal adventure fiction. The fact that discovery itself is fatal suggests you're dealing with something too real, too true to be defeated by conventional heroism. The protagonist of The Call of Cthulhu ends his manuscript hoping he'll die before Cthulhu fully awakens. He knows the truth now, and he can't unknow it. The manuscript we're reading is essentially his suicide note, though he hasn't killed himself yet. He's just waiting. This framing device is disturbing because it suggests that the information in the story is genuinely dangerous. Not dangerous to fictional characters, dangerous to anyone who understands it fully. And here's where the myth building reaches its ultimate sophistication. Lovecraft's inconsistencies actually strengthen the mythology rather than weakening it. The Elder Sign looks different in different stories. Cthulhu's appearance varies slightly, depending on who's describing him. The Necronomicon's publication history doesn't quite line up across multiple references. These should be problems. They should break the illusion. Instead, they make it more convincing. Real historical records are inconsistent. Different witnesses describe the same event differently. Texts get mistranslated, miscopied, corrupted over time. If Lovecraft's mythology was perfectly consistent, it would feel artificially constructed. The inconsistencies suggest it's being glimpsed from multiple partial perspectives, none of them complete, all of them attempting to describe something that resists accurate description. This is how Lovecraft made fictional cults feel like hidden history, through cross-referencing that built cumulative evidence, through documentary framing that mimicked historical research, through collaboration that suggested independent corroboration, through blending fiction with reality until the boundary became unclear, and through embracing inconsistency as a feature rather than a flaw. The result is a mythology that feels discovered rather than invented, and that feeling has consequences we're still dealing with. Because once you've created something that feels this real, it starts leaking out of fiction into the world. Now we need to look at what these cults actually believe, what they worship, and why any human being would choose to join them. The cults in Lovecraft's stories don't worship gods who love them. They worship entities who don't know they exist. That's the core philosophical premise, and it's more disturbing than any monster description. Think about traditional religion for a moment. Whether you're Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, the central premise is that the universe cares about human beings. Maybe through a personal God who answers prayers, maybe through karmic systems that respond to your actions, maybe through natural laws that allow spiritual growth. But there's always some relationship between human behavior and cosmic structure. What you do matters to something bigger than yourself. Lovecraft's cults operate on the opposite premise. The outer gods exist on such a vastly different scale that human existence doesn't register. We're not important enough to be evil to them. We're not important enough to be victims. We're just incidentally in the way. When Cthulhu wakes, he won't hate humanity. He won't even notice us as he reclaims Earth. We'll be destroyed as a side effect, the way you destroy an anthill when you're building a house. Not because you're against ants, you just needed the land. This creates a specific theological problem. Why would anyone worship something that doesn't care? The cultists in Lovecraft's stories have different answers, but they cluster around a few core ideas. Some worship because they've accepted cosmic insignificance and found it liberating. If nothing matters, if the universe doesn't care, then human morality is just a social construct. You're free to do whatever serves the old ones because conventional ethics are revealed as meaningless. This isn't nihilism, exactly. It's post-nihilism. It's what comes after you fully accepted that nothing matters and decided to act anyway. Others worship because they've glimpsed the actual structure of reality and realized resistance is pointless. In the Call of Cthulhu, the text mentions that the cult knows that when the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. This is presented as factual astronomy, not mythology. The cultists aren't believing in allegories. They're responding to cosmological information. Their worship is pragmatic. The old ones will return. You can either acknowledge this and try to position yourself favorably, or you can deny it and be swept away unknowing. There's also hereditary predisposition. Multiple Lovecraft stories suggest that some bloodlines are more susceptible to the psychic pull of the outer gods. This isn't about choice, it's about biology. If your ancestors worshipped Cthulhu, if they bred with Deep Ones or made pacts with Azathoth, that ancestry marks you. The call comes through your blood. Robert Olmsted in The Shadow over Innsmouth tries to resist, tries to remain human, but eventually his Innsmouth heritage asserts itself. He transforms because he was always going to transform. The cult didn't recruit him. His DNA recruited him. Time functions differently in these belief systems. The cults are obsessed with cycles, with astronomical alignments, with waiting for when the stars are right. This phrase appears repeatedly across multiple stories. It suggests the outer gods exist in relationship to cosmic geometries humans can barely perceive. They're locked away not by magic or divine intervention, but by the current arrangement of stellar positions. When those positions shift, and they will, given enough time, the locks will open automatically. This makes the cult's activities feel inevitable rather than evil. They're not trying to overthrow the natural order. They're preparing for when the natural order changes. It's going to happen whether anyone worships or not. The cultists have just accepted it ahead of time. This is why they can wait so patiently. Whether it takes another century or another millennium doesn't matter. Human timescales are irrelevant to beings that have existed for aeons. Knowledge operates as a corrosive force in this framework. The more you understand about reality's actual structure, the more human concerns feel absurd. In The Whisperer in Darkness, Albert Wilmarth receives letters from Henry Akeley describing encounters with alien entities in Vermont. As Wilmarth learns more, his comfortable academic worldview falls apart. By the story's end, he's fled back to civilization traumatized, knowing things he can't share because no one would believe him. The knowledge hasn't empowered him, it's crippled him. He can't go back to teaching literature and pretending human culture matters when he knows what's actually out there. The cultists have passed through that traumatic revelation and come out the other side. They're post-traumatic. They've processed the information and built new frameworks around it. This is what makes them dangerous. Not that they're crazy, that they've achieved a terrible clarity. They see what everyone else is refusing to see, and that sight has reorganized their priorities entirely. Dreams function as the primary transmission mechanism for cult recruitment. You don't usually choose to join. You start having dreams, the same images every night, strange geometries, impossible angles, cities that don't follow Euclidean principles, and you wake up knowing things you didn't know before, phrases and languages you've never studied, compulsions to travel to specific locations. The dream isn't metaphorical. It's a literal psychic broadcast from R'lyeh or Kadath or whatever non-Euclidean space the old ones inhabit. This suggests consciousness isn't as individual as we think. If entities can reach into your dreams and plant information there, then your mind isn't a sealed fortress. It's permeable, vulnerable. The boundaries between self and other aren't as clear as Enlightenment philosophy suggests. The cults understand this. They've accepted that individual consciousness is just a localized phenomenon in a much larger mental field. They're nodes in a network, not autonomous agents. All of this creates a theology without hope. Traditional religions offer salvation, enlightenment, escape from suffering. Lovecraft's cults offer only accurate information about your species' irrelevance and eventual extinction. The question isn't, will we be saved? It's, do you want to know the truth before it happens? Some people, when confronted with that choice, choose truth, even when truth is annihilation, even when knowing changes nothing except your awareness of what's coming. That's the philosophical core. Now let's look at the specific entities these cults worship and what that worship actually entails. The outer gods aren't a unified pantheon. They don't have relationships with each other the way Greek or Norse gods do. They exist independently, often in different dimensions, sometimes unaware of each other. The cults that worship them vary accordingly. Cthulhu is probably the most famous, but he's actually not the most powerful. He's a great old one rather than an outer god, a distinction that matters theologically. Cthulhu is trapped in R'lyeh, a sunken city somewhere in the South Pacific. He's dreaming there, dead but not dead, waiting for the stars to align properly so he can wake. His cult operates through those dreams. People across the world, artists, sailors, anyone sensitive enough, receive dream transmissions, images of R'lyeh, the chant Fenglui Mglwanaf, Cthulhu, R'lyeh, Ugahnagol, Ftagn, an overwhelming compulsion to create art depicting something that shouldn't be depicted. The cult doesn't have central organization. It can't. Cthulhu's asleep. He's not giving orders in any direct sense. Instead, susceptible individuals respond to the psychic leakage from R'lyeh. They find each other through those shared dreams. When police raided the Louisiana swamp cult in the Call of Cthulhu, they found people who'd never met but were performing identical rituals. That's how Cthulhu worship works. It's viral, self-organizing. You don't join, you catch it. The Deep Ones worship Cthulhu, but also have their own cult dynamics. They're amphibious humanoids living in underwater cities, and they've developed a specific breeding program with humans. The esoteric order of Dagon in Innsmouth represents the most successful version of this program. Captain Obed Marsh made contact with Deep Ones in the 1840s. They offered abundant fish catches in exchange for human breeding partners. 3 generations later, most of Innsmouth's population was hybrid. The worship wasn't abstract theology. It was practical eugenics, preparing humans to transition into aquatic life. Nyarlathotep operates completely differently. He's called the Crawling Chaos, the messenger of the outer gods, and he actually interacts with humans directly. Unlike Cthulhu, who's trapped, or Azathoth, who's mindless, Nyarlathotep moves through human society deliberately. He appears in different forms, sometimes as an Egyptian pharaoh, sometimes as a preacher, sometimes as the haunter of the dark. His cults tend to be more organized because he's actively recruiting. He wants worshippers, not because he needs them, but because corrupting humans entertains him. The Starry Wisdom sect in Providence worshipped a manifestation of Nyarlathotep called the Haunter of the Dark. They brought a strange trapezohedron from Egypt that allowed them to summon this entity. The sect operated openly for years before being shut down. Their church still stands. Robert Blake discovered it in the 1930s and made the mistake of investigating. The entity killed him. What makes Nyarlathotep's cults distinctive is that they offer something resembling benefits: knowledge, power, transformative experiences. You join because you get something, even if that something eventually destroys you. Shub-Niggurath, called the Black Goat of the Woods with 1,000 young, presides over fertility cults. Her worship involves rural New England communities performing rites on specific calendar dates: May Eve, Halloween, the solstices. Old Whately in the Dunwich Horror calls to her during rituals on Sentinel Hill. These cults are less about summoning and more about breeding, producing offspring that are part human, part something else. Wilbur Whately is the result of one such ritual. His father is Yog-Sothoth, but Shub-Niggurath's influence is there in the fertility magic that made the conception possible. Yog-Sothoth is described as the key and the gate. He exists in all times and all places simultaneously. Worshipping him means attempting to transcend normal space-time. The Whately family cult centered on summoning Yog-Sothoth and breeding with him. Old Whately spent years preparing his daughter Lavinia for this. Thaifia's result was twins: Wilbur, who looked mostly human except for certain tells, and his brother, who was invisible and massive and eventually grew too large to be contained. These aren't metaphorical entities. In Lovecraft's framework, they're as real as planets or galaxies. The cults worship actual beings that exist in space-time, even if they exist in dimensions humans can't normally perceive. This is crucial. We're not talking about psychological projections or Jungian archetypes. We're talking about things that have mass and extension and can interact with physical reality. The horror comes from their reality, not their symbolism. Hastur and the yellow sign represent a slightly different tradition. This came partly from Ambrose Bierce and partly from Robert Chambers' The King in Yellow. The yellow sign is a symbol that, once seen, marks you. Hastur's worship involves theatrical performances, artistic creation, things that spread the infection mimetically. You don't necessarily know you're worshiping Hastur. You just create art that contains the yellow sign, or perform a play that shouldn't be performed, and that act constitutes worship, whether you intended it or not. What's disturbing about all of these entities is that they don't need worship. Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of infinity, doesn't even know worship is happening. Cthulhu's dreaming regardless of whether anyone chants his name. Yog-Sothoth exists outside time and therefore experiences all worship, past, present, and future, simultaneously, which means each individual act is meaningless to him. The entities don't require devotion. They'll continue existing and will eventually reclaim Earth, whether anyone worships them or not. So why do the cults worship? Because they're acknowledging reality, because they've seen something true and are responding to it the only way humans know how, through ritual, through community, through organized submission, to forces beyond their control. Worship isn't for the gods' benefit, it's for the worshippers. It gives them a framework for processing cosmic horror. It transforms abstract dread into concrete practice. You can't fight Cthulhu, but you can chant his name. You can carve his image. You can gather with others who understand. The ritual doesn't change anything, but it makes the horror bearable. And sometimes the entities notice. Not often, but sometimes. And when they do, the cultists get what they wanted. Contact, transformation, proof that they were right all along, even if that proof kills them. Now let's look at the humans who make this choice and what happens to them. The question Lovecraft keeps circling is whether the cultists are insane or whether they're the only sane people in his stories. Everyone else is living in comfortable denial. The cultists have faced reality directly. Take Robert Olmsted in The Shadow over Innsmouth. He goes to this decaying Massachusetts coastal town doing genealogical research. He notices the townspeople look strange. Bulging eyes, flat noses, skin that looks rough and scaled in certain light. They move in an odd shuffling manner. The town is dying, most buildings abandoned, but fish are still being caught somehow. Olmsted investigates and discovers the truth. Most of Innsmouth's population is hybrid, part human, part deep one. They're slowly transforming into aquatic beings who will eventually leave land entirely and join their relatives underwater. Here's what makes this psychologically complex. Olmsted is horrified. He escapes. He writes his account. But the story ends with him discovering that he has Innsmouth ancestry himself. The transformation is starting in him too. And in the final paragraphs, his horror shifts. He starts thinking about the underwater cities, about swimming in ocean depths, about joining his relatives. The revulsion becomes acceptance, then anticipation. He ends the story planning to go back, to complete the transformation, to dive into the ocean and never surface. Is that madness, or is it accepting the inevitable? Olmsted's biology was always going to assert itself. Fighting it just delayed the outcome. Once he understands this, resistance seems pointless. The transformation isn't corruption, it's maturation. From the Deep One's perspective, humans are larvae, hybrids are pupae. Full transformation is adult form. Olmsted's initial horror was just a larva's fear of metamorphosis. Lovecraft uses madness as a buffer between revelation and acceptance. His protagonists typically go through stages. First is denial. There must be a rational explanation. Then comes horror. The explanation is real, but it's terrible. Then madness. The mind breaks under information it can't process. And finally, sometimes comes a clarity on the other side of madness. That's when you become a cultist, when you've broken and reassembled yourself around the new information. The Whately family demonstrates this progression across generations. Old Whately started out normal. He studied forbidden texts and learned things that changed him. He became increasingly isolated, increasingly focused on his occult research. By the time he impregnated his daughter with Yog-Sothoth's offspring, he was completely dedicated to the cult's purposes. His grandson Wilbur never went through the stages because he was born into it. He was raised with the knowledge that would drive others mad. To Wilbur, summoning outer gods was normal family business. The horror is that for him, it was normal. Gender dynamics in Lovecraft's cults are revealing. Women appear most often as vessels. Lavinia Whately is bred to Yog-Sothoth. The women of Innsmouth are mated with deep ones. Lovecraft's deep anxiety about reproduction, about miscegenation, about bloodlines being corrupted, all of this gets projected onto cult practices. The women in these stories rarely have agency. They're mediums, hosts, breeding stock. This reflects Lovecraft's era and his personal anxieties, but it also suggests something about how he understood genetic contamination to work. The mother's body is the site where human and non-human merge. Social marginalization functions as a recruitment vector throughout the stories. The cults flourish in isolated communities. Pacific islands where indigenous populations maintain traditions Western civilization tried to suppress. Appalachian settlements where poverty and geographic isolation kept people separate from mainstream culture. Immigrant neighborhoods in cities where recent arrivals maintained old world practices. Lovecraft's racism is evident here. He associates non-Anglo-Saxon populations with susceptibility to cult influence. But there's also a class dimension. The wealthy academics who investigate cults do so from comfortable positions. The people who join cults are usually poor, marginalized, desperate. This creates an unsettling implication. Maybe cosmic horror is easier to accept when your life is already horrible. Maybe if you're an impoverished fisherman in a dying town, the promise of transformation into something inhuman doesn't seem so bad. You're giving up very little. The academics and professors who investigate get to retreat to their universities and try to forget. The poor have no such luxury. Accepting the cult's truth might be the most rational choice available. Wilmarth in The Whisperer in Darkness represents the academic trajectory. He's a folklore professor at Miskatonic University, investigating reports of strange creatures in Vermont's hills. He corresponds with Henry Akeley, a scholar living in isolation, studying these entities. As evidence accumulates, Wilmarth's comfortable academic skepticism erodes. He visits Akeley and discovers that the entities are real, that they're planning something, and that Akeley has been altered, possibly killed and replaced, or possibly transformed into something that wears Akeley's appearance. Wilmarth escapes, but he's destroyed psychologically. He can't publish his findings. No one would believe him. He can't continue his career pretending this didn't happen. He's stuck in liminal space between conventional reality and cosmic horror. That liminal space is where cults recruit. You've seen too much to go back, but you haven't fully committed to the new reality. The cult offers community, others who know what you know, rituals that acknowledge the horror instead of denying it. For someone in Wilmarth's position, the cult becomes attractive, not despite its horror, but because of it. At least they're not pretending everything is normal. The conversion process isn't usually voluntary in Lovecraft's stories. You don't decide to join a Cthulhu cult the way you might decide to join a church. Instead, you're exposed to information or experiences that change you. You read the Necronomicon. You witness a ritual. You have the wrong dreams. And once you've been exposed, you can't unexpose yourself. The information is in your head now. It's reorganizing your thoughts, whether you want it to or not. This is why Lovecraft's protagonists so often die or go mad. The human mind isn't equipped to hold cosmic horror and conventional reality simultaneously. You either reject the horror, denial, which usually gets you killed, accept the horror, cult membership, which means you're no longer recognizably human, or break under the contradiction, madness, which is at least a survival response, even if not a functional one. The cultists have taken the second path. They've accepted. They're functional. They hold jobs, raise families, participate in community life. But underneath that functionality, they're waiting, preparing, knowing something everyone else refuses to know, and that knowledge has transformed them fundamentally. They're not human in the same way anymore. They're post-human. Not through technology or evolution, but through epistemology. They know what's coming, and that knowledge has already changed them into something else. Now, we need to understand what specific texts and practices enable this transformation. What do cultists actually read, and what happens when you read it? The Necronomicon sits at the center of Lovecraft's mythology. It's the book that shouldn't exist, written by Abdul al-Hazred, the Mad Arab, around 730 CE, originally titled Al-Azif in Arabic, the word referring to nocturnal insect sounds that Arabs believed were produced by demons. Al-Hazred supposedly spent years in the empty quarter of Arabia, the Rub al-Khali, alone with things that drove him mad. He wrote down what he learned there. Then he was torn apart in a Damascus marketplace by an invisible entity in 738 CE. Witnesses reported he was attacked by nothing. He just came apart screaming. The book was translated into Greek as Necronomicon by Theodorus Philetas in 950 CE. Then into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228 CE. The Arabic original was supposedly lost when the great library of Alexandria burned. Though this doesn't make chronological sense, since that library was destroyed centuries before Al-Hazred was born. These kinds of inconsistencies appear throughout Lovecraft's references. They should break the spell. Instead, they suggest a text so cursed that even its history can't be recorded accurately. What does the Necronomicon actually contain? We get fragments across multiple stories, instructions for summoning Yog-Sothoth, descriptions of the Old One's history before humanity existed. The famous couplet, "That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons, even death may die." Information about when the stars will align properly for the Old Ones to return. Spells for opening dimensional gates. Details about entities that exist in angles of space humans can't perceive. But here's what's crucial. Reading it changes you, not metaphorically, literally. Characters who consult the Necronomicon emerge altered. Their handwriting changes. Their speech patterns shift. They develop obsessions. They start having dreams they can't control. The book isn't just information, it's infection. The knowledge it contains reorganizes your neurology. Miskatonic University in Arkham keeps a copy in their library. It's restricted. You need special permission. Several faculty members have consulted it over the years. Some disappeared. Others went mad. At least one died under mysterious circumstances. The university knows the book is dangerous, but keeps it anyway, because scholars need access to primary sources. This perfectly captures the academic dilemma Lovecraft was exploring. Knowledge shouldn't be suppressed, even dangerous knowledge. But what if some knowledge is genuinely lethal? Other forbidden texts appear across the mythology. Unaussprechlichen Kulten by Friedrich von Junst, Unspeakable Cults in English, supposedly documents hidden worship across history. Von Junst was murdered in his apartment in 1840. The killer was never found. The Book of Eibon, written by a wizard in ancient Hyperborea, contains information about Satogwa and other entities. Cultes des Ghouls by Comte d'Erlet describes necrophagic practices and entities that feed on corpses. The Narcotic manuscripts, fragments supposedly predating human civilization entirely. Lovecraft creates a network of textual references, each book citing others, building an illusion of intertextual scholarship. The Necronomicon references the Narcotic manuscripts. Unaussprechlichen Kulten quotes the Book of Eibon. This is how real academic texts work. They reference each other, build on each other, form scholarly conversations across centuries. Lovecraft mimicked that structure for forbidden knowledge. Each text adds pieces to an overall pattern that no single book contains completely. The texts aren't usually how normal people encounter cult knowledge. They're rare, restricted, locked in special collections. Instead, ordinary. People stumble into cult influence through artifacts. Robert Blake, in The Haunter of the Dark, finds an abandoned church. Inside is the shining trapezohedron, a strange artifact brought from Egypt. When he looks into it, he sees across dimensions. He sees the Haunter, and the Haunter sees him back. Blake becomes obsessed. He returns repeatedly. He starts having nightmares. Eventually, the entity kills him during a thunderstorm. He didn't read a grimoire. He just looked into the wrong object at the wrong angle. Archaeological evidence poses another vector for contamination. Investigators find bas-reliefs in Pacific Islands showing Cthulhu, statues in New England forests depicting entities that shouldn't exist, underground temples in desert regions. Each discovery seems academically valuable. Document it, photograph it, bring samples back to museums. But the artifacts carry information. Looking at them too long starts the process. You begin understanding the proportions, the geometries, the implications. And understanding is corruption. The investigator's trajectory is remarkably consistent across Lovecraft's stories. Someone hears rumors about strange events. Being rational and educated, they investigate. They collect evidence. They read relevant texts. They interview witnesses. They're doing everything properly according to academic methodology. And precisely because they're thorough, precisely because they follow every lead, they learn too much. The investigation itself is the trap. Henry Armitage in The Dunwich Horror represents the exception. He's a scholar at Miskatonic University who's read the forbidden texts but remained functional. When Wilbur Whately tries to borrow the university's Necronomicon, Armitage refuses. When strange events start happening around Dunwich, Armitage recognizes what's occurring. He assembles a team, travels to Sentinel Hill, and performs a counter-ritual to banish what the Whateleys have summoned. He succeeds. But Armitage is rare in Lovecraft's work, a scholar who knows enough to act but hasn't known so much that he's been absorbed by the cult perspective. What makes knowledge forbidden isn't that it's false, it's that it's true. This distinguishes Lovecraft's approach from most horror fiction. The Necronomicon doesn't contain lies or delusions. It contains accurate information about reality's structure. That accuracy is what makes it dangerous. If it were nonsense, reading it would be harmless. But because it describes things that actually exist, entities, dimensions, cosmic arrangements, understanding it means accepting that human civilization is built on comfortable ignorance. There's a specific kind of horror in this. We're taught that knowledge is good, that education liberates you, that understanding the world makes you more capable. Lovecraft inverts this Enlightenment confidence. In his framework, some knowledge genuinely makes you less functional. Not because it's incorrect, but because human psychology isn't equipped to integrate it. We're evolved to survive on Earth's surface in social groups across human timescales. Information about entities that exist across dimensions and aeons doesn't fit that framework. Trying to integrate it breaks something fundamental. The cults are composed of people who've broken in this specific way and then rebuilt themselves around the new information. They're post-epistemic collapse. They've gone through the crisis of understanding and emerged altered. This makes them dangerous, not because they're violent. Most Lovecraft cultists aren't particularly violent, but because they're evangelistic. They want others to understand what they understand, not from malice, from a kind of desperate honesty. They can't unknow what they know, and they can't bear being alone with that knowledge. So they leave clues, they publish fragmentary accounts, they create art depicting impossible geometries. They establish churches and orders and societies. They're trying to share the burden. And every time someone picks up those clues and investigates, the cult grows. Not through recruitment meetings or mission trips, through the inevitable progression of inquiry. If you're curious enough, rigorous enough, persistent enough, eventually you'll learn what the cultists learned, and then you'll become one of them. That's the real horror of forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's mythology. It's not forbidden by external authorities. It's forbidden by its nature. It destroys conventional human consciousness, not through supernatural curse, but through simple incompatibility. Some information is too large, too alien, too contradictory to what makes us human. And once you have it, there's no going back. Now we need to look at specific stories where these cults appear in action, where we see exactly what they do, how they operate, and what happens to the people who encounter them. Lovecraft's cult mythology didn't emerge fully formed. It developed gradually across his work, each story adding layers until the pattern became clear. The earliest hints appear in stories where worship is present, but not yet systematized. Dagon, written in 1917, gives us the prototype. A sailor escapes from German captivity during World War I and finds himself alone on a vast expanse of ocean floor that somehow surfaced. He discovers a massive stone monolith carved with images of aquatic beings. Near it, he sees something, a creature he describes as having the general outline of the human form, but with a certain vagueness or indefiniteness of detail. The creature appears to be worshipping the monolith. The sailor flees, eventually makes it back to civilization, but he's haunted. He ends his written account knowing the creature will come for him. The story concludes with him planning suicide before it arrives. This establishes the template: ancient worship, isolated locations, entities that are almost but not quite human-shaped, and the witness who can't escape what he's learned. But Dagon doesn't yet have organized cults or named entities. It's just one sailor encountering one worshiper. The mythology is still germinal. The Nameless City from 1921 pushes deeper. The narrator explores ancient ruins in the Arabian desert, finding a city built on a scale too small for humans. The architecture suggests the inhabitants were reptilian. He discovers galleries showing the history of this race, how they worshipped, how they built their civilization, how they eventually retreated underground when the surface became uninhabitable for them. The final lines reference Abdul al-Hazred and quote what will later be identified as coming from the Necronomicon: "That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die." Now we have pre-human worship, and the first reference to Lovecraft's most important forbidden text. The festival, written in 1923, brings the cult structure into New England. The narrator travels to Kingsport for a family gathering that occurs once per century. His relatives lead him through the town to an ancient church. Underground, he discovers a chamber where hooded figures conduct rituals. They ride on the backs of penguin-like creatures through vast caverns. The narrator realizes his family has participated in this for generations. This is the first time Lovecraft shows hereditary cult membership, the idea that you inherit these obligations through bloodline. Then comes The Call of Cthulhu in 1926, and everything crystallizes. This story structures itself as a documentary investigation. Francis Thurston is organizing his dead uncle's papers when he discovers evidence of a global cult. The story moves through three distinct sections: a New Orleans police raid on swamp cultists, an academic article about dreams and cult psychology, and a Norwegian sailor's encounter with Cthulhu himself when Arlie briefly surfaces. What makes this revolutionary is the scope. Previous stories showed isolated cults or individual worshippers. The Call of Cthulhu reveals that cults exist simultaneously across the world. In Louisiana, cultists perform voodoo orgy rituals. In Greenland, Eskimo communities report strange dreams. Artists in Paris sculpt impossible figures without knowing why. Pacific Islanders maintain traditions their ancestors learned before recorded history. These groups don't coordinate through normal communication. They're all receiving the same psychic transmissions from sleeping Cthulhu. The story also gives us the most complete cult theology. The cultists believe the great old ones lived ages before there were any men and came to the young world out of the sky. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, but when the stars were wrong, they could not live. This cosmology explains why the cults wait rather than act. They're not trying to make something happen. They're preparing for something inevitable. When stellar alignments shift, the old ones will return automatically. The cults are just announcing it ahead of time. Cross-referencing becomes systematic after this. The Dunwich Horror, in 1928, mentions the Necronomicon extensively, quoting from it, showing how it's used in actual ritual practice. At the Mountains of Madness, from 1931, references the Pnakotic manuscripts and describes the Old One's history in Antarctica, suggesting they created life on Earth as a biological experiment. The Shadow over Innsmouth, also from 1931, mentions the Cthulhu cult in passing, while focusing on the esoteric order of Dagon. The Dreams in the Witch House, from 1932, connects Salem witch trials to genuine occult practices involving entities from other dimensions. Each story assumes the others are true. Characters reference events from previous stories. Investigators consult the same forbidden texts. Locations reappear. Arkham, Miskatonic University, the Miskatonic River Valley. This creates cumulative weight. If you only read one story, you might dismiss it as an isolated weird tale. Reading multiple stories, you start seeing patterns. The connections suggest these aren't independent fictions. They're different investigators documenting the same underlying reality. Robert Blake's story, The Haunter of the Dark, from 1935, explicitly connects to the Starry Wisdom cult, which supposedly operated in Providence in the 1840s before being shut down. Blake finds their abandoned church and the shining trapezohedron they used for worship. This directly ties Lovecraft's fictional cults to actual Providence history and geography. You can visit the real church that inspired this story. The blending of real and fictional locations makes the mythology harder to dismiss. The collaborative expansions amplified this effect. Clark Ashton Smith's stories added Sathogua worship and Hyperborean cults. Robert Bloch contributed urban cult variants in contemporary settings. August Derleth systematized everything after Lovecraft's death, though his systematization sometimes contradicted Lovecraft's original vision. Frank Belknap Long added the Hounds of Tindalos and other entities. Robert E. Howard, primarily known for Conan, wrote The Black Stone, which mentions mysteries of the worm and connects to Lovecraft's mythology. Now, multiple authors were treating these cults as real. Readers encountering Bloch's work might see a Necronomicon reference and recognize it from Lovecraft. Smith's stories mentioned Arkham. The cross-pollination suggested independent corroboration. If different writers discovered evidence of the same cults, maybe those cults actually existed. The collaborative mythology building worked because it mimicked how real historical research operates, multiple scholars investigating the same phenomena from different angles. This intertextual web is what made Lovecraft's cults feel discovered rather than invented. By 1936, you could read dozens of stories by multiple authors, all referencing the same texts, entities, and organizations. The consistency wasn't perfect. Different writers had different interpretations. But that inconsistency actually strengthened the illusion. Real historical sources disagree on details. The varied interpretations suggested something too large and complex for any single author to capture completely. Now let's look closely at the two most fully realized cult narratives, where Lovecraft showed exactly how these organizations operate and what they do to the communities they inhabit. The Shadow over Innsmouth is Lovecraft's most detailed cult narrative. It's the only story where we see a cult that's essentially taken over an entire town, and it shows us something deeply disturbing about how these organizations actually function. Robert Olmsted is taking a sightseeing tour through New England in 1927. He's doing genealogical research and decides to visit Innsmouth, a decaying coastal town in Massachusetts. The bus driver warns him. The ticket agent looks concerned. Everyone who knows about Innsmouth suggests he skip it, but Olmsted is curious. He's young, educated, rationalist. How bad could it be? Innsmouth is worse than he imagined. The buildings are rotting. Most are abandoned. The few people he sees move in a shuffling, amphibious manner. They have bulging eyes, flat noses, rough skin that looks almost scaled. Very few normal-looking people remain, and those few are clearly frightened. The town smells like fish and rot. Something is profoundly wrong here, but Olmsted can't initially determine what. He meets Zadok Allen, an elderly drunk who's one of the last normal people left. Zadok tells him the town's history. Captain Obed Marsh started trading with Pacific Islands in the 1830s. He discovered natives worshipping something called Dagon and making contact with aquatic beings, deep ones, who lived in underwater cities. These beings offered a deal: abundant fish catches in exchange for interbreeding with humans. Obed brought this arrangement back to Innsmouth. The initial resistance to Obed's cult was overcome through economic pressure. Innsmouth's traditional fishing collapsed. Only Obed's ships brought in catches. Eventually, people accepted the arrangement. The esoteric order of Dagon was established. The cult built a new hall, and the breeding program began. Humans mated with deep ones. The offspring looked mostly human at first, but as they aged, the transformation accelerated. By middle age, the hybrids were developing gills, webbed fingers, bulging eyes. Eventually, they'd leave land entirely and join the underwater cities. This is eugenics as horror. The cult isn't forcing anyone. They're offering prosperity, and people accept. 3 generations later, almost everyone in Innsmouth has Deep One ancestry. The Innsmouth look marks you. The transformation is inevitable once you have the bloodline. You might resist for a while, but eventually your biology asserts itself. You'll start dreaming of the ocean depths. You'll feel uncomfortable on land, and one day you'll walk into the sea and not come back. Olmsted discovers that a federal raid in 1928 torpedoed Devil Reef, the Deep One settlement offshore, and arrested many esoteric order members. But the raid didn't stop the transformations. It just drove them underground. The hybrids who haven't fully transformed remain in Innsmouth, maintaining the appearance of a normal town while waiting to complete their metamorphosis. What makes this truly horrifying is Olmsted's own discovery. After escaping Innsmouth and investigating his family history, he learns he has Innsmouth ancestry himself. His grandmother was a marsh. The transformation is starting in him. He's beginning to dream of Nyarlathotep, the underwater city. His facial features are changing subtly, and his horror at this discovery gradually shifts to acceptance, then anticipation. The story ends with Olmsted planning to return. He'll free his cousin from the asylum where he's being held. Together, they'll go to Innsmouth, then into the ocean, then down to Nyarlathotep where they belong. The transformation isn't corruption, it's destiny. Fighting it was pointless. He was always going to become this. The esoteric order of Dagon represents Lovecraft's most complete cult structure. They have a physical headquarters, the Masonic Hall converted for their purposes. They conduct public ceremonies that look almost normal to outsiders. They maintain businesses and civic institutions. The cult isn't hidden in swamps or operating from abandoned churches. It's the government, the economy, the social structure. Everyone in Innsmouth either belongs to the order or is so marginalized they can't resist it. This inverts the traditional cult narrative where a small, dangerous group threatens normal society. In Innsmouth, the cult is society. Normal humans are the endangered minority, and the federal government's attempted intervention, torpedoing the reef, arresting cultists, doesn't solve anything. You can't arrest a biological process. The hybrids are transforming whether anyone approves or not. The story also demonstrates Lovecraft's anxieties about immigration and racial mixing, which are impossible to ignore. The deep ones are explicitly foreign. The breeding program produces degenerate offspring. Innsmouth's decay is directly linked to this racial contamination. Lovecraft's racism is embedded in the horror structure. He's not just using miscegenation as a metaphor, he's saying it literally creates monsters. But the story transcends its racism through the ending's ambiguity. Is Olmsted's acceptance of his transformation a defeat or an apotheosis? He frames it as finally understanding his true nature. From one perspective, he's been corrupted. From another, he's completing a natural developmental process. Human to hybrid to deep one. That's not degeneration. That's metamorphosis. The story refuses to definitively choose between these interpretations. The shadow over Innsmouth shows a cult that succeeds. They don't get dramatically defeated. The federal raid is presented as a temporary setback. The transformations continue. The underwater cities remain, and people like Olmsted, who discovered the truth while trying to resist it, eventually join willingly. The horror isn't that the cult might win. The horror is that they have already won. Innsmouth proves it's possible for these organizations to completely subsume a community and produce biological changes that can't be reversed. Now let's look at a different cult structure. Isolated, rural, focused not on aquatic transformation, but on dimensional summoning. The Dunwich Horror takes place in rural Massachusetts, in hill country where poverty and isolation have left communities cut off from modernity. Dunwich is dying. Young people leave for cities. Buildings collapse. The few remaining families maintain old ways that educated people would consider superstitious. Into this environment, the Whately family performs a decades-long cult operation. Old Whately is the architect. He's collected forbidden texts. The Necronomicon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, the Book of Eibon. His library represents decades of obsessive acquisition. He's not an academic. He's a marginalized rural eccentric. But he's read these texts and understood them in ways most scholars don't. He knows how to contact Yog-Sothoth, the entity described as the key and the gate, existing in all times and places simultaneously. Old Whately prepares his daughter Lavinia for a specific purpose. We're never told exactly what this preparation involves, but the implication is years of ritual conditioning. On Candlemas 1913, something happens. The hills echo with unnatural sounds. Lavinia Whately gives birth to twins. One, Wilbur, looks mostly human, though he matures at an impossible rate. The other is invisible, or perhaps exists in dimensions human eyes can't properly perceive. Wilbur Whately is the result of breeding a human woman with Azathoth. He grows to maturity in 10 years. His appearance is almost human. He passes in public. But there are tells. He's massive, over 7 feet tall. His voice sounds wrong. When he's killed later in the story and his clothes are torn away, witnesses see that below the waist he's covered in black tentacles. His face has goat-like features. He's a hybrid, human enough to operate in human society, but alien enough to fulfill his cult function. Old Whately raises Wilbur with specific knowledge. The boy learns the rituals. He understands the texts. He knows his purpose, to open dimensional gates and summon the old ones back to Earth. This requires specific conditions, astronomical alignments, the right location, and most importantly, access to the complete Latin Necronomicon. Miskatonic University has one of the few complete copies. The invisible twin, Wilbur's brother, grows faster and larger. They keep it in the farmhouse initially, then in an enlarged barn. Old Whately dies in 1924, and control becomes difficult. Lavinia disappears in 1926, presumably killed and eaten by the entity. Wilbur maintains it alone, feeding it cattle, reinforcing the barn as it grows massive. Meanwhile, the Dunwich community maintains its own cult traditions. On May Eve and Halloween, groups gather on Sentinel Hill for rituals. They're not all Whately associates. These are general community practices, maintained across generations. Old Whately's family is distinguished by going further, attempting things the general population wouldn't risk, but the underlying cult structure supports them. Dunwich has been primed for this by centuries of isolated occult practice. Wilbur travels to Arkham in 1928 to access the Necronomicon at Miskatonic. He needs the complete text to finalize his summoning ritual. Henry Armitage, the head librarian, refuses. Armitage has read enough forbidden texts to recognize what Wilbur is planning. Wilbur tries to break into the library at night and is killed by the guard dog. When his body is examined, his true nature becomes clear. He's not human. He was never human. He was always a gateway, being wearing approximately human form. With Wilbur dead, the invisible twin breaks free. It rampages through Dunwich, crushing buildings, destroying farms, leaving destruction that follows a pattern moving toward Sentinel Hill. Witnesses describe it as massive, like a barn-sized mass. It smells horrifically. It produces sounds that hurt to hear. The entity is heading toward the ritual site on Sentinel Hill, possibly to complete the summoning Wilbur couldn't finish. Armitage realizes what's happening. He assembles a team, 2 other professors who've also studied forbidden knowledge. They travel to Dunwich with spray devices containing a formula derived from passages in the Necronomicon. On Sentinel Hill, as the entity manifests and begins its ritual, they spray it and recite a banishing. The entity becomes briefly visible. Witnesses see something with tentacles and eyes and writhing appendages, far too large to be real. Then it dissolves, vanishing back to whatever dimension spawned it. The Dunwich horror demonstrates a different cult structure than Innsmouth. The Whateleys operate as a family unit embedded in a community that practices low-level occultism. The broader Dunwich population isn't part of the Yog-Sothoth cult specifically, but they're habituated to occult practice generally. This creates an environment where the Whateleys can operate without being reported to authorities. The community is complicit through tolerance born of their own similar traditions. The story also shows biological hybrid worship taken to its endpoint. Wilbur isn't human corrupted by knowledge. He's something else given partial human form to operate in human contexts. His entire existence serves the cult's purpose. He's a tool, a gateway, a vessel for bringing through something larger. The tragedy is that Wilbur apparently has human-level consciousness. He thinks, plans, reads, studies. But his biology compels him towards summoning. He can't choose otherwise. His nature determines his actions. The community's role is particularly disturbing. Dunwich residents know something is wrong at the Whateley farm. They hear sounds. They see cattle disappearing. Buildings are damaged. But they don't intervene, partly from fear, partly from cultural acceptance of occult practice, and partly because several families have their own problematic traditions they don't want examined. The cult succeeds not through secrecy, but through mutual unwillingness to investigate each other's activities. Armitage's victory is also ambiguous. He stops this particular summoning, but the texts remain. The knowledge exists. Other isolated families in other rural areas are attempting similar things. The Whateleys aren't unique. They're just the ones who got furthest before being stopped. And Armitage had to use the Necronomicon's own formulas to achieve the banishing. He fought occult practice with occult knowledge. That makes him functionally similar to the cultists, just pointed in the opposite direction. The story reveals that cosmic horror cults don't require cities or organization. A single family with the right texts and enough isolation can attempt to end human civilization. The resources needed are minimal: books, rituals, willingness to breed with entities from beyond. The Whateleys almost succeeded using resources that wouldn't have cost more than a decent library collection. That accessibility is terrifying. It suggests cult operations could be happening anywhere. Rural poverty and isolation create environments where transgressive practices can continue unexamined. These two stories, Innsmouth and Dunwich, show Lovecraft's cult mythology at its most developed. Now let's see how other writers expanded and reinterpreted these templates. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, other writers inherited his mythology and transformed it. Some expansions stayed faithful to his vision, others reinterpreted significantly. The collaborative development that had begun during his life accelerated into something more complex. August Derleth became the primary curator. He'd corresponded with Lovecraft and considered himself the mythology's guardian. Between 1939 and his death in 1971, Derleth published extensively using Lovecraft's notes and creating his own editions. His most significant contribution was systematization. Where Lovecraft's cults were chaotic and alien, Derleth organized them into an elemental framework. He created opposing forces: elder gods who were benevolent versus outer gods who were malevolent. Cthulhu became associated with water, Nyarlathotep with air. This gave the mythology structure but violated Lovecraft's core premise, that the entities were beyond human concepts like good and evil. Derleth also made the cults more explicitly satanic. In Lovecraft's work, the entities didn't care about humanity enough to be evil toward us. Derleth's versions actively worked against human interests. His cultists were villains in more conventional ways, conducting black masses, making satanic pacts, pursuing power. This made the stories more traditionally gothic, but less cosmically horrifying. The dread of insignificance was replaced by the familiarity of devil worship. Robert Bloch took a different approach. His contributions, particularly The Shambler from the Stars, 1935, brought Lovecraftian cults into urban contemporary settings. Where Lovecraft's cults operated in isolated areas or among marginalized populations, Bloch showed them in cities, among educated people, in modern contexts. His cultists were writers, artists, academics, people who'd encountered forbidden knowledge through intellectual curiosity, rather than geographic isolation. This expanded the mythology's range. You didn't need to visit decaying coastal towns to encounter cosmic horror. It could be in your library, your university, your friend's apartment. Clark Ashton Smith contributed extensively, creating his own interconnected mythology that occasionally overlapped with Lovecraft's. His Hyperborean cycle featured Satogua worship, a toad-like entity that inspired cults through sheer grotesque appeal. Smith's cultists were often sorcerers seeking personal power, making them more active and less fatalistic than Lovecraft's passive worshippers. The Book of Eibon, Smith's invented grimoire, became as important in the expanded mythology as the Necronomicon. Smith's prose was more ornate than Lovecraft's, emphasizing decadence and aestheticized horror. Frank Belknap Long added the Hounds of Tyndalos and Chaunar Fawn, entities with their own cult structures. His contributions emphasized temporal horror, cults that existed across different time periods, accessing forbidden knowledge from both past and future. This temporal dimension added complexity. Now you could have cults coordinating across centuries, planting seeds in one era to bear fruit in another. Robert E. Howard, primarily known for sword and sorcery, contributed The Black Stone, 1931, which referenced mysteries of the worm and connected his own horror fiction to Lovecraft's framework. Howard's approach emphasized more visceral, violent horror. His cultists were barbaric, savage, engaging in human sacrifice and cannibalism. This contrasted with Lovecraft's more cerebral horror, but added the mythology's range of possibilities. Henry Kuttner wrote The Salem Horror and other stories connecting New England witch trials to genuine occult practices. He suggested that what Puritan authorities called devil worship was actually surviving pre-human cult activity. This historical grounding was effective. It implied that documented historical events, the Salem trials, were responses to real supernatural threats. Kuttner's work helped bridge Lovecraft's invented mythology with actual historical anxieties. Ramsey Campbell, starting in the 1960s, relocated cosmic horror to Britain. His Severn Valley replaced Lovecraft's Miskatonic Valley. His entities, Glocky, the cults around the lake, operated in industrial English towns rather than rural New England. Campbell's cultists were working-class British people, not American academics or fishermen. This geographic shift proved the mythology could transplant to other cultures. The core concepts, cosmic indifference, forbidden knowledge, biological corruption, translated across national contexts. Brian Lumley's Titus Crow series, 1970s, 1980s, took the mythology in a more science-fictional direction. His cults used technology alongside magic. The Cthulhu Mythos became a kind of alternative physics rather than supernatural horror. Lumley's approach was controversial among purists, but demonstrated how the framework could accommodate different genre conventions. His cultists were often organized like intelligence agencies, with hierarchies and strategic planning. Thomas Ligotti, writing from the 1980s onward, returned to Lovecraft's philosophical core while developing his own style. His cults were often manifestations of consciousness itself turning against reality. Where Lovecraft's horror was cosmic, Ligotti's was ontological. His cultists weren't worshipping external entities, but rather responding to realizations about existence's fundamental hollowness. This represented a sophisticated evolution, taking Lovecraft's premises to their logical philosophical conclusions. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981, systematized cult structures in ways that influenced subsequent fiction. The game required mechanics for how cults operate, what rituals actually do, how investigators counter them. Sandy Peterson and other designers created comprehensive cult organizations with hierarchies, resources, methods. While this was for gameplay purposes, it fed back into fiction. Writers who'd played the game incorporated its logical structures into their stories. Modern writers like Caitlin R. Kiernan and Laird Barron have continued evolving the mythology. Kiernan's work emphasizes LGBTQ perspectives, questioning Lovecraft's heteronormative assumptions. Her cultists include queer characters, whose marginalization makes them receptive to cosmic horror in ways Lovecraft didn't consider. Barron's stories feature cults within corporate structures, government agencies, and wealthy families. His approach updates Lovecraft's class anxieties for contemporary contexts where elite power operates through institutions rather than decaying mansions. What's remarkable is how durable the core concepts proved. Across 9 decades and hundreds of writers, the basic framework remains recognizable. Cults worshiping entities that don't care about humanity, forbidden texts that corrupt readers, knowledge that destroys rather than liberates, biological corruption through hybrid breeding. These premises survive translation across cultures, genres, and eras. The collaborative expansion also revealed something interesting. No single author owns cosmic horror cults anymore. Lovecraft created the template, but the mythology has become genuinely collaborative, shared property developed by multiple creative voices. This mirrors how actual mythologies develop. No one owns Greek mythology. Multiple storytellers contributed across centuries. Lovecraft's cult framework has achieved similar status. It's a shared vocabulary for exploring certain anxieties about knowledge, biology, and cosmic insignificance. The variations matter because they show what's essential versus what's historically contingent. Lovecraft's racism was contingent. Later writers removed that while keeping the cosmic horror. His New England settings were contingent. The concepts transplanted successfully to Britain, urban America, and other contexts. But the core premise, that some knowledge is genuinely dangerous, and some entities are too alien for human comprehension, that remains essential across all variations. Now we need to see what happened when this fictional mythology started leaking into the real world. How did invented cults inspire actual practices? Where's the boundary between fiction and reality? And has that boundary held? The Necronomicon doesn't exist, but try telling that to the people who bought copies. In 1973, a bookstore in New York started selling a version supposedly edited by someone named Simon. The book claimed to be a translation of the genuine Necronomicon, drawing from Sumerian mythology and ancient Mesopotamian magical practices. It had rituals, invocations, descriptions of gates between worlds. The introduction explained that the text had been discovered and translated, that this was the real, forbidden book Lovecraft had referenced. Thousands of people bought it. Some used it in actual magical practice. The Simon Necronomicon was a hoax, but it was a sophisticated one. It blended Sumerian god names with Lovecraft's invented entities, creating something that felt historically plausible. Marduk became connected to elder gods. Tiamat was reinterpreted as an outer god. The ritual structure borrowed from genuine grimoire traditions. If you didn't know Lovecraft's biography, if you weren't familiar with how he invented these elements, you might believe this was real recovered ancient knowledge. Other Necronomicon editions followed. The Al-Azif versions claimed to be translations from Arabic originals. Some were clearly labeled as fiction, authorized versions approved by Lovecraft's estate. Others maintained the pretense of authenticity. By the 1980s, you could find multiple competing Necronomicons, each claiming to be the real one, each contradicting the others in ways that somehow made them all feel more authentic. Real historical texts exist in multiple contradictory versions. The proliferation of fake Necronomicons mimicked that scholarly confusion. Libraries reported patrons requesting the Necronomicon at circulation desks. This happened frequently enough that some created standard responses. Yale's Sterling Memorial Library was rumored to have a copy in restricted collections, though this was false. Miskatonic University doesn't exist, but people asked about visiting it. The town of Arkham appeared on some amateur maps of Massachusetts. Innsmouth became a tourist destination for horror fans, though no town by that name exists on the Massachusetts coast. The 1980s and 90s saw chaos magic practitioners adopting Lovecraft's entities. Groups like the Illuminates of Thanateros treated the outer gods as egregores, thought forms given power through concentrated belief. Their argument was interesting. If enough people believe in Cthulhu, does that belief grant the entity some form of existence? Not physical existence necessarily, but psychological reality? These practitioners weren't claiming Lovecraft had discovered real entities. They were claiming that his inventions had become real through collective imagination. Phil Hine and other chaos magicians published rituals for invoking Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, and other Lovecraftian entities. They framed this as experimental magic, testing whether fictional constructs could function as effectively as traditional spirits or demons. The results were subjective, difficult to verify, but practitioners reported experiences, vivid dreams, synchronicities, psychological transformations. Whether these were genuine contact or self-induced psychological effects didn't particularly matter to them. The boundary between imagination and reality was what they were exploring. Urban legends developed around supposed real Cthulhu cults. Internet forums in the early 2000s shared stories about groups performing rituals in abandoned buildings. Creepypasta narratives described finding cult evidence, carved symbols, ritual implements, manuscripts in unknown languages. These stories followed a pattern. The narrator investigates, discovers more than expected, experiences something that might be supernatural or might be psychological breakdown, and ends the account uncertain what was real. The H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, founded in 1987, occupies an interesting space between performance and belief. They create props, Necronomicon replicas, Miskatonic University identification cards, Cthulhu idols, with meticulous historical accuracy to Lovecraft's descriptions. They perform rituals from the stories, shot-for-shot recreations done with period-appropriate costumes and settings. Members discuss the mythology with scholarly seriousness. They're clearly aware it's fiction, but they engage with it as if it were real, and that sustained engagement creates something psychologically real, even if not literally real. Some participants report that extended engagement with Lovecraft's mythology produces psychological effects, recurring dreams, heightened anxiety about cosmic insignificance. difficulty returning to conventional religious frameworks after spending time contemplating the outer god's indifference. This isn't supernatural influence. It's sustained meditation on disturbing philosophical premises. If you spend enough time seriously considering humanity's cosmic irrelevance, that consideration changes how you think. There have been alleged cult activities involving violence. In isolated cases, people committing crimes have referenced Lovecraft's entities. These are statistically rare, far less common than crimes involving mainstream religious or political motivations. But they receive attention because they're unusual. When they occur, the question becomes, was the person inspired by Lovecraft's fiction, or were they already unstable and the mythology just provided convenient symbolism? Most analysis suggests the latter. Lovecraft's work doesn't create violent impulses, but it can provide a framework for expressing impulses that already existed. The internet has accelerated this blending of fiction and claimed reality. Wikis catalog Lovecraft's entities with the same scholarly thoroughness applied to actual mythology. Discussion forums debate the true nature of various outer gods. YouTube videos present documentary-style investigations of real Necronomicon evidence. The production values are high enough that distinguishing satire from sincere belief becomes difficult. Some creators are clearly joking. Others seem genuinely uncertain, and some audiences take it seriously regardless of the creator's intent. Social media has also enabled what looks like cult recruitment, but is actually collaborative fiction. Alternate reality games use Lovecraft's framework. Mysterious accounts posting cryptic messages, coordinates leading to hidden objects, puzzles that reveal fragments of supposed forbidden knowledge. Participants know it's a game, but the experience of investigating, of feeling like you're uncovering hidden truth, produces genuine psychological engagement. The game becomes real in its effects, even while remaining fictional in its content. This raises uncomfortable questions about belief and reality. If a fictional cult inspires real psychological experiences, is it still entirely fictional? If practices derived from invented entities produce subjective results indistinguishable from traditional mystical experiences, what does that suggest about all mystical experiences? Lovecraft's mythology has become a testing ground for these questions. It served as a kind of control group. We know these entities were invented, so any experiences people have can't be attributed to the entity's literal existence. Whatever's happening must be psychological. But that doesn't make it less real to the people experiencing it. The hoaxes and claimed sightings continue. Every few years, someone announces they've found the real Necronomicon. Someone reports a cult operating in their area. Someone shares footage of something they claim is a deep one or a dimensional gate. Almost all of these are hoaxes or misunderstandings, but the persistence is revealing. Lovecraft created mythology with a gap where proof should be. We never see the entities directly. We never read complete forbidden texts. We never witness successful summonings. That gap invites filling. People who want these things to be real can project their desires into that carefully constructed absence. Now let's look at how this mythology has been adapted into media that millions of people have experienced directly. Lovecraft's cults have proven remarkably difficult to adapt to visual media. The horror relies on suggestion, on gaps in knowledge, on cosmic scales that resist representation. But creators keep trying, and some succeed by embracing those limitations. Film has struggled most with direct adaptation. The Call of Cthulhu was filmed multiple times, but the most effective version came in 2005 from the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society. They made it as a silent film using 1920s techniques, black and white, title cards, theatrical acting styles. This decision was brilliant. Silent film's artificiality prevented the problem of showing too much. When Cthulhu appears, rendered in stop-motion animation, the dated technique makes him unsettling rather than ridiculous. Modern CGI would make him look fake. 1920s stop-motion makes him look like something that doesn't follow normal physical rules. Stuart Gordon's Dagon in 2001 relocated the Innsmouth story to modern Spain. The esoteric order becomes a Catholic church that's been corrupted into worshipping aquatic entities. The film makes the cult's operations explicit. We see rituals, hybrid transformations, the underwater city. This violates Lovecraft's technique of suggestion, but it works because the film commits fully to body horror. The transformations are visceral, painful, biological. People's faces crack open as gills emerge. Their skin splits to reveal scales underneath. The cult isn't abstract theology. It's a medical process being performed on unwilling participants. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness from 1994 takes a different approach. It's about a horror novelist whose books start manifesting reality. His fictional town becomes real. His fictional cult members emerge into the world. The film's premise directly engages with the question we've been circling. Can fiction become real through belief? Carpenter suggests yes. The movie's cult operates through narrative infection. Reading the books changes you, makes you part of the story, eventually makes you complicit in summoning what the story describes. This is probably the most philosophically sophisticated Lovecraft adaptation in film. The Void in 2016 gives us a cult of surgeons who've discovered that mutilating human bodies in specific ways opens dimensional gates. They're creating hybrid entities through surgical modification rather than breeding. The film's cultists are motivated by grief. They're trying to resurrect loved ones and discovering that what comes back isn't quite what left. This adds emotional weight that Lovecraft rarely provided. His cultists were usually motivated by curiosity or cosmic understanding. The Void's cultists are motivated by love, which makes their monstrousness more disturbing. Gaming has actually succeeded better than film at adapting Lovecraft's cult structures. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981, gave players the investigator role. You're not fighting monsters. You're researching cult activities, usually unsuccessfully. The game's sanity mechanics reflect Lovecraft's epistemological horror. Learning too much literally damages your character. Knowledge reduces your effectiveness. This makes the game feel like Lovecraft's stories, where investigation leads to psychological collapse. The Arkham Horror board game series creates emergent cult narratives. Players attempt to prevent Old One awakenings, while cultist activities progress automatically. You can't eliminate the cults. You can only slow them down. Games usually end with either the players barely preventing catastrophe or the Old One's awakening and everyone losing. This captures Lovecraft's pessimism about humanity's long-term prospects. Even when you win, you've only delayed the inevitable. Bloodborne, released in 2015 for PlayStation, might be the most successful Lovecraft adaptation in any medium. It's set in a Gothic city called Yharnam, where a medical institution called the Healing Church has discovered that old blood from ancient entities can cure diseases. They've built their entire social structure around blood ministration. As the game progresses, you discover the church is actually a cult worshipping beings called Great Ones. The blood isn't medicine, it's transformation serum. People are slowly becoming beasts or ascending to higher dimensions. The game never explains everything. You piece together the cult's history through item descriptions, environmental storytelling, cryptic dialogue. The incompleteness is intentional. You finish the game still uncertain about crucial details, which perfectly captures Lovecraft's approach. The Secret World MMO incorporated multiple Lovecraftian cults as enemy factions. The filth is a dimensional infection spreading through human populations. Various cults have formed around it, some trying to spread it, some trying to harness it, some trying to stop it. Players encounter cult bases around the world, each adapted to local culture. The Korean cult operates differently than the American cult operates differently than the Egyptian cult. This global variation reflects Lovecraft's vision in The Call of Cthulhu, of cults emerging independently, across cultures. Music subcultures have extensively adopted Lovecraft's imagery. Death metal bands in particular found his mythology compelling. Morbid Angel named themselves after a Lovecraftian concept. Their albums reference entities and locations from the stories. Nile built their entire aesthetic around combining Egyptian mythology with Lovecraft's framework. Their lyrics describe rituals, summonings, cosmic entities, using the musical brutality to convey scale and horror that lyrics alone couldn't achieve. The appeal for metal musicians makes sense. They were already exploring themes of transgression, forbidden knowledge, cosmic horror. Lovecraft provided a non-Christian framework for those themes. Instead of singing about Satan, which had become somewhat cliched by the 1990s, they could sing about Yog-Sothoth or Nyarlathotep. These entities were less culturally overused. They represented something genuinely alien, rather than just Christianity's antagonist. Dark ambient and industrial musicians have used Lovecraft's work differently. Artists like Atrium Carceri create soundscapes suggesting vast empty spaces, underwater cities, dimensional gates. There are no lyrics usually, just sound design evoking cosmic dread. The label Cryochamber explicitly curates Lovecraft-inspired dark ambient, with albums themed around specific entities or locations. Listening becomes a kind of meditation on cosmic insignificance. You're not entertained exactly. You're being made uncomfortable in ways that feel philosophically significant. Neo-folk and martial industrial artists have incorporated Lovecraft's mythology into explorations of civilizational decline. Bands like Death in June, or Current 93, reference the outer gods while discussing European cultural collapse, pre-Christian traditions surviving underground, esoteric knowledge suppressed by modernity. This usage is more politically fraught. Some neo-folk has far-right associations, but it demonstrates how Lovecraft's cult imagery can be deployed in discussions about cultural memory and historical trajectories. What's interesting about these musical adaptations is that they often add emotional intensity Lovecraft's prose lacks. Lovecraft wrote with scholarly distance. Metal and industrial musicians perform with visceral intensity. They're embodying the horror rather than documenting it. This changes the mythology's feel. In Lovecraft's stories, cult worship is something you observe with disturbed fascination. In metal performances, it becomes something you participate in, even if only theatrically. The audience at a Morbid Angel show, chanting along to lyrics about Azathoth, is performing a kind of mock ritual. They're not actually worshiping, but they're engaging with the imagery in an embodied rather than intellectual way. This has created interesting feedback loops. People discover Lovecraft through games or music, then read the original stories and are surprised by how different they are. The adaptations have become as culturally significant as the source material. For many people, their understanding of Lovecraft's cults comes primarily through Bloodborne or Call of Cthulhu RPG, rather than the original fiction. The mythology has become genuinely collaborative and multimedia in ways that transcend any single creator's vision. Now let's see how academic and subcultural communities have theorized these cult narratives and what they reveal about human psychology. Lovecraft scholarship became academically respectable relatively recently. For decades, his work was dismissed as pulp horror. But starting in the 1980s and accelerating in the 2000s, serious academic analysis emerged, examining what his cult narratives reveal about modernist anxieties, epistemological crises, and philosophical pessimism. S.T. Joshi's biographical and critical work established Lovecraft as worthy of serious literary analysis. Joshi's H.P. Lovecraft: A Life and his critical studies demonstrated how Lovecraft's philosophical materialism shaped his horror. The cults aren't just plot devices. They're expressions of Lovecraft's genuine belief that the universe is mechanistic, purposeless, and indifferent to human values. Joshi showed how Lovecraft was working through Enlightenment philosophy's implications. If rationalism and materialism are correct, if there's no divine purpose, then what does that mean for human meaning-making? The cults represent one answer: organized submission to cosmic meaninglessness. Michel Houellebecq's H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, took a different approach. Houellebecq, himself a novelist, argued that Lovecraft's horror emerged from his total rejection of life itself. The cults worship entities that represent obliteration. They're death cults in the most literal sense. Organizations devoted to ending biological existence. Houellebecq framed this as Lovecraft's ultimate negation, his refusal of everything vital, sensual, or humanistic. This reading is controversial, but captures something real about the cult's function. They don't promise transcendence or afterlife. They promise extinction, and they frame that extinction as liberation from the burden of consciousness. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet brought Lovecraft into contemporary philosophy discussions. Thacker examines the world without us, the universe as it exists independent of human perception. Lovecraft's entities and the cults that worship them exemplify this concept. They represent reality's aspects that don't require human existence and won't notice human extinction. Thacker uses Lovecraft to explore philosophical pessimism and cosmic horror as legitimate responses to modern scientific knowledge. We've discovered we're not cosmically significant. Lovecraft's cults are rational responses to that discovery. Groups that have accepted cosmic indifference and reorganized their behavior accordingly. Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology engages with Lovecraft through the concept of weird realism. Harman argues that Lovecraft's entities demonstrate philosophical points about how objects exist independent of human categories. The outer gods can't be fully understood or categorized because they genuinely exist outside human conceptual frameworks. The cults attempt to relate to these entities despite that impossibility. Harman sees this as philosophically sophisticated. Lovecraft was exploring genuine epistemological problems through horror fiction. Feminist and post-colonial scholars have criticized Lovecraft's cults while acknowledging their cultural impact. Scholars like Joshi and others have documented how Lovecraft's racism, misogyny, and xenophobia shaped his cult narratives. The cults are often associated with non-white populations. Women function as vessels for monstrous births. Degenerate bloodlines produce hybrid horrors. These aren't accidental associations. They're core to how Lovecraft imagined cosmic horror working. Critics argue this reveals more about early 20th century American anxieties than about any cosmic reality. But this criticism has led to productive reclamation. Writers like Victor Laval in The Ballad of Black Tom and Matt Ruff in Lovecraft Country have rewritten Lovecraft's narratives from the perspectives of the marginalized people he feared. In these works, cosmic horror becomes a metaphor for racism's psychological violence. The cultists and entities represent white supremacy's institutional power. This reclamation doesn't erase Lovecraft's racism, but it demonstrates how his horror framework can be repurposed to examine the actual horrors marginalized people face. The new weird literary movement, writers like China Miéville, Jeff Vandermeer, and Caitlin R. Kiernan, has evolved Lovecraft's cult structures beyond his original prejudices. Miéville's Kraken features a cult devoted to a preserved giant squid in a London museum, but the cult includes characters of all backgrounds, and the horror comes from ontological rather than racial transgression. Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy presents governmental and quasi-religious responses to an expanding zone of biological transformation, exploring institutional failure rather than individual corruption. Kiernan's work features queer characters encountering cosmic horror, questioning Lovecraft's heteronormative assumptions about reproduction and transformation. Academic conferences now regularly feature Lovecraft panels. Necronomicon, held in Providence, brings together scholars, writers, and fans. Papers examine his influence on horror cinema, his philosophical implications, his problematic legacy, and its necessary criticism. The discussion is more sophisticated than simple celebration or dismissal. Scholars recognize Lovecraft created genuinely innovative horror, while also acknowledging how his personal prejudices shaped that innovation in disturbing ways. Gaming studies scholars have examined how Lovecraftian cult mechanics in games affect player psychology. Studies of Call of Cthulhu RPG players show the sanity system creates genuine anxiety. Players become emotionally invested in their investigator's mental health in ways they don't with hit points or other mechanical resources. This suggests Lovecraft's epistemological horror, the idea that knowledge itself can destroy you, translates effectively into game design. The cults in these games become more threatening than physical combat encounters because they threaten the player's ability to continue playing. Popular culture analysis has noted how Lovecraft's cult imagery appears in contexts far from academic horror. True crime podcasts use similar investigative structures, piecing together evidence, discovering hidden organizations, revealing uncomfortable truths. Conspiracy theory communities use language remarkably similar to Lovecraft's cult narratives: hidden knowledge, initiated elites, reality different from what mainstream sources claim. QAnon specifically borrowed Lovecraftian structures: secret cults operating in plain sight, coded messages revealing truth, the promise that understanding these patterns provides special knowledge. This parallel is disturbing because it suggests Lovecraft's cult narratives tap into cognitive patterns that make conspiracy theories compelling. Both offer frameworks where confusion and anxiety can be reorganized into pattern. Both suggest surface reality conceals deeper truth. Both position the believer as someone who knows what others are too blind or cowardly to acknowledge. The difference is that Lovecraft's cults are explicitly fiction, while conspiracy theories claim factual truth. But the psychological appeal is similar. Media studies scholars examine how Lovecraft's cult imagery circulates in internet culture. Memes featuring Cthulhu or references to forbidden knowledge proliferate across platforms. Often these are humorous. Cthulhu 2024. Why vote for the lesser evil? But humor doesn't empty them of significance. Internet communities form around shared references, and Lovecraft's mythology provides vocabulary for discussing feelings of cosmic insignificance, meaninglessness, and dread. The cults become metaphors for various threatening institutions: governments, corporations, social media algorithms that seem to operate according to inhuman logic. Academic and subcultural engagement with Lovecraft's cults reveals they've transcended their original context. They're no longer just elements in early 20th century horror stories. They've become cultural tools for thinking about knowledge, power, belief, and humanity's relationship to forces beyond our control. Whether analyzed philosophically, adapted creatively, or deployed in critical reclamation projects, the cult structures Lovecraft created continue generating new meaning. They've become genuinely mythological in the classical sense. Shared cultural narratives that can be endlessly reinterpreted to address contemporary concerns. Now we need to address the most important question. Why do these cult narratives still resonate? What psychological and philosophical needs do they fulfill? We need to confront something uncomfortable. Lovecraft's cult narratives are more culturally relevant now than when he wrote them. This should surprise us. Horror fiction usually becomes dated. The anxieties that generated it fade. But cosmic horror cults have intensified in resonance. Why? Start with what we've learned since 1937. The universe is bigger than Lovecraft imagined. The observable universe contains roughly 2 trillion galaxies. Earth is one planet orbiting one star among hundreds of billions of stars, in a galaxy that's unremarkable among billions of galaxies. We've discovered that most of the universe's content is invisible to us, dark matter and dark energy that we can detect only through gravitational effects. 95% of reality is, by current understanding, imperceptible. We've learned that cosmic timescales dwarf human existence more extremely than Lovecraft suggested. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. Human civilization is maybe 10,000 years old. We're infinitesimally brief. These discoveries make Lovecraft's premise, that cosmic reality is indifferent to human existence, not speculative but factually supported. His cultists who accept cosmic insignificance aren't deluded. They're responding accurately to what science has revealed. This creates psychological tension. We're taught that knowledge liberates us, but astronomical knowledge has revealed our complete cosmic insignificance. How do you integrate that information without the psychological structures religions historically provided? Lovecraft's cults offer one framework. They acknowledge reality's indifference and build community around that acknowledgement. They don't pretend humans matter cosmically. They don't claim divine purpose or ultimate meaning. They accept we're accidents in an uncaring universe, then organize behavior accordingly. For people experiencing what's sometimes called cosmic despair, depression or anxiety specifically about existential meaninglessness, these cult structures can seem psychologically honest in ways conventional institutions aren't. Consider how we discuss climate change. Scientific consensus says human civilization is altering Earth's climate in ways that will cause massive disruption. We know this. The evidence is overwhelming. Yet most people continue living as if it's not true. We can't integrate the information. It's too large, too threatening, too demanding of behavioral change. We experience collective denial despite factual awareness. Lovecraft's cultists don't experience this split. They know something terrible is coming. They accept it fully. They live with that knowledge, consciously. There's something almost appealing about that psychological honesty, even if what they're honest about is horrifying. The cults also offer community around shared dread. Modern life is often isolating. Traditional communities based on geography, religion, or extended family have weakened. Many people experience existential anxiety alone. Lovecraft's cult structures promise community specifically for people who've glimpsed something terrible about reality. You're not alone with your dread. Others know what you know. You can gather together, perform rituals that acknowledge the horror, feel less isolated in your understanding. This is why Lovecraft-inspired communities online can be genuinely supportive spaces, even while discussing deeply pessimistic philosophy. There's also the appeal of submission to the inevitable. Modern culture emphasizes individual agency, personal responsibility, the ability to shape your own destiny. This creates enormous pressure. You're responsible for your success or failure. If you're unhappy, you should fix it. If you're anxious, you should manage it. The cult structure offers escape from that pressure. You can't stop Cthulhu. The stars will align eventually. Your individual actions don't matter on cosmic scales. There's something psychologically relieving about accepting complete powerlessness. You're not responsible for preventing cosmic horror. You're just acknowledging it's coming. Technology has created another resonance point. Artificial intelligence, social media algorithms, global financial systems, these operate according to logics most people don't understand. They shape our lives profoundly. They make decisions affecting us. But they're not human. They don't have human values or human psychology. They're systems optimizing for outcomes that don't necessarily align with human flourishing. This creates an experience remarkably similar to what Lovecraft's characters felt, encountering the outer gods. We're at the mercy of non-human intelligence operating, according to principles we can't fully grasp. The cultists who worship such entities don't seem as irrational anymore. Epistemological collapse, the sense that you can't trust your information sources, that everything might be lies or mistakes, has become common. Traditional authorities have lost credibility. Media is fragmented. Experts disagree. Disinformation spreads rapidly. Many people feel they can't know what's true. Lovecraft's investigators experience this constantly. They uncover information that contradicts everything they were taught. They can't verify it through conventional sources. They're forced into epistemic crisis. That crisis is now widespread. The cults represent communities that have moved through crisis to a new, if disturbing, certainty. The worship of indifferent entities also speaks to post-religious psychology. In Western cultures, Christianity's decline has left psychological voids. We lost framework for processing suffering, death, meaninglessness. Many people can't return to traditional religion. They don't believe it, but secular alternatives often feel insufficient. Philosophical naturalism says we're biological machines in a purposeless universe. True, perhaps, but psychologically unsatisfying. Lovecraft's cults occupy interesting middle ground. They're not secular. They acknowledge entities beyond human comprehension. But they're not traditionally religious. These entities don't love you or offer salvation. They're post-religious theological structures. They might represent what religious impulses become when you can't believe in beneficent divinity, but can't fully eliminate the religious impulse either. Biological horror has become more salient. Genetic engineering, gene editing, synthetic biology. We're now capable of modifying human biology in ways that would have seemed impossible in Lovecraft's era. The question of what happens when humanity starts altering its own nature is no longer science fiction. It's contemporary, bioethics. Lovecraft's hybrid cults, breeding programs between humans and non-humans, creating children who belong to neither species. These now read as extrapolations of real technological possibilities. We're entering an era where human nature might become negotiable. The horror of the Innsmouth transformation seems less fantastic and more like a metaphor for voluntary human enhancement or genetic modification. There's also the simple psychological fact that cosmic horror cults offer narrative structure for overwhelming anxiety. If you feel dread but can't identify why, Lovecraft's mythology provides explanatory framework. Maybe your anxiety isn't personal pathology. Maybe you're sensing something true about reality that others are repressing. The cult framework reinterprets anxiety as insight. This can be psychologically appealing, even if intellectually questionable. It transforms feeling bad into knowing something. The question we're left with is whether engaging with this mythology helps or harms. Does contemplating cosmic insignificance and worshiping indifferent entities provide philosophical clarity? Or does it risk genuine psychological damage? Lovecraft's stories suggest the latter. His investigators who learn too much usually die or go mad. But his readers generally don't. We can engage with these ideas, find them philosophically interesting, and continue functioning. Maybe that boundary between fictional engagement and genuine belief is what protects us. Or maybe that boundary is dissolving. The chaos magicians who started using Lovecraft's entities in actual practice, the people who report altered psychology after sustained engagement with the mythology, the way conspiracy theories borrow cult narrative structures. These suggest the fiction is leaking into reality in ways that are psychologically real, even if not literally true. We're left with uncomfortable implications. Lovecraft created cult structures to express his philosophical pessimism and personal anxieties. Those structures have proven remarkably durable and increasingly relevant. They speak to genuine human experiences of cosmic dread, epistemological collapse, and biological anxiety. They offer community around shared horror. They provide frameworks for accepting rather than denying uncomfortable truths. But they also potentially normalize submission to the inevitable, organize surrender to meaninglessness. They frame resistance as futile and acceptance as wisdom. They suggest knowledge that disturbs you should be embraced rather than questioned. These are psychologically dangerous positions, even if they feel philosophically honest. Perhaps the most disturbing implication is this: the readers and gamers and musicians engaging with Lovecraft's mythology. We're performing something very close to what his fictional cultists do. We're gathering in communities around shared engagement with cosmic horror. We're creating rituals, gaming sessions, metal, concerts, rereading favorite stories. We're spreading the mythology to new people. We're treating it with a seriousness that goes beyond normal fictional engagement. We're not actually worshiping Cthulhu, but we're doing something remarkably similar to what worship looks like: sustained attention, communal practice, finding meaning in something larger than ourselves. The fact that we know it's fictional might not protect us as much as we think. The psychological processes are the same, whether the object is real or imagined. The transformation is occurring not in our bodies, but in our thinking, in how we understand ourselves relative to cosmic scales. Lovecraft's cult members are people who've learned something they can't unknow and have organized their lives around that knowledge. If you've read this far, if you've engaged seriously with these ideas, haven't you done something similar? You can't unknow that the universe is vast, old, and indifferent. You can't unknow that human meaning is something we create rather than discover. You can't unknow that cosmic horror is, in some sense, just reality presented honestly. The cults are still recruiting, not through supernatural means, through the logical progression of following ideas to their conclusions. Lovecraft built a mythology that survives because it describes something psychologically and philosophically real. The entities might be fictional, but the experience of cosmic insignificance isn't. The knowledge might not literally drive you mad, but it does change how you think. You already know what the cultists know. The only question is whether you'll accept it.